I'm Alan.
I'm Ryan.
And Adam.
So today we're going to be talking a bit about imported foods versus local foods. So what we're going to be tackling is the question of what the economic implications are of replacing imported foods with local products. We're also going to go into a little bit of detail about sort of other factors that play into local food. What sort of steps we can take to transition away from a dependency on imported foods. This is going to be informed by interviews that we conducted with vendors of boutique food products at Evergreen Brickworks Market. And we're also going to provide a couple of recommendations that are, again, informed by that research. So a little bit of context about local foods. So the question is, what are we trying to accomplish with local foods? So there's a few sort of categories here, but we're mostly focusing on economic. But just to sort of bring everybody to the same sort of framework, I guess. So ecological advantages, we've talked about those before in our own studies and also in this course. There's a shorter distance to transport those goods. So that means less transportation infrastructure is involved, so less emissions. Seasonal produce is abundant, and then we can take advantage of that so that we can meet our food needs without having to rely necessarily on grains or vegetables or so other things like that from other places. For the economic aspects of it, local producers, we're keeping money within our community because of the sort of cutting out of the middleman. Like, we're removing the wholesaler and the distribution and all this other aspects which are common to industrial scale farming. We can either lower prices or have them at the same price as what you would see in a big box grocery store, but more of that money is staying with the producer that's actually using that money to continue their business. And for empowerment, the social side of things, we have a more direct relationship between the producer and the consumer. So you see where your food is coming from, you see the people that are actually involved in doing that, and sort of by doing that, you're making sure that your money is going towards somebody that's genuinely invested in producing a good product, and they're not just doing it for a profit motive. Obviously that's a factor, but they have a genuine care for what their product means to people. And improving access to healthy alternatives. So we talk about food deserts, we talk about barriers to access. By offering local food at the same price as, say, what you see in a grocery store, and giving them that opportunity to connect with local producers, then we can improve access for people and meet people's needs.
Alright, so just to frame this whole, these circumstances in the Canadian context, the David Suzuki Foundation has researched a number of things in relation to how far food travels. So they found that the average Canadian meal travels approximately 1,200 kilometers from farm to table. We know that 80% of fruits and vegetables that Canadians eat are imported, and that the majority of Canada's domestic produce is grown between June and October, and that's largely due to our harsh winters that prevent us from growing at all other times of the years. Over 50% of the produce that we import comes from the United States. And as well, the present trajectory of federal government policy is to continue this trend towards increasing trade and agricultural imports, and this was justified in a statement by the Department of Agriculture as saying that Canadian farmers and processors rely on trade and benefit directly from increased market access and development of global markets. So that's just to frame, where we're at in terms of this import-local dilemma.
So let's get to the actual project. So the methods, again, we went to Brickworks Market in Toronto. It's located off the DP. I don't know if you have been there. It's a pretty cool place. So we interviewed two vendors there. They gave us a lot more than we were hoping for, so good on them. And of course, we did a secondary research, all of us. Journal articles. One of our interviewees actually did a TED Talk in 2008 or 9. He's actually researching chocolates and the importing of chocolate in, what was it, Cuba?
Mexico, he's all over the place.
Yeah, but he's doing his master's right now at Brock, so, was it Trent?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, so the first that's Michael Sacco. He works for Chocolate Sol.
Yeah, so this is our first interviewee. So he works for Chocosol and he's sort of involved in both the production, the distribution, the marketing. He's very, very deeply knowledgeable about the entire system of chocolate and sort of boutique food products in general. So he did his training in Oaxaca. And he learned a lot of different aspects of chocolate production across all of the chocolate producing nations. So when we asked him about local foods, he said, like, what's the idea of local? So he was more on the social side of things, not necessarily ecological or economic, but he was talking about the connection between the producer and the consumer and the sort of empowerment that the producer gains by having a more direct connection to the market. And what he introduced as a concept was the idea of trans-local foods. So when we think of local, we think geographically, spatially local, so within 100 kilometers. But his idea of trans-local was that instead of, say, imported chocolate, like you grow the cacao somewhere in Central America, and then it gets shipped somewhere, and then it gets processed somewhere else, and it gets shipped around the world. There's a hierarchy there which he avoids, or sort of gets rid of entirely by going with this translocal approach. The producers are very closely connected to the eventual market. So it's kind of like they're geographically separated, but the same sort of approach to distribution is there. It goes up one level to the from the farmer to the processor, and then it goes horizontally to the eventual market and back down one level. So you remove the wholesale, you remove the distribution, you remove the advertising. They work very much in the same way as, say, a startup or something that's very close to home. When we asked him about what sort of role that policymakers and governments can have in sort of promoting local foods, he suggested higher subsidies and taxes. He didn't want to promote programs, but he said it should be done through the tax system. And that education around local foods is a goal. And this is a quote from his profile when he did a TEDx talk here at Waterloo. It says, "Chocolate is an expression and vehicle for our dignity, creativity, and learning." So he's sort of promoting the idea that food is an avenue for social development.
So, and then we interviewed Lisa Sweetman, who works for Earth and City. So she actually does the same thing as, she works actually with Michael, with Chocosol for some of their imports. So they do bring a few things from abroad, especially off season, that they can't grow. So they work together, which is something that we thought was interesting because, like, you know, it's hard when these companies come together to import. It's a lot easier for them sharing their resources. It just reduces the transportation costs and, you know, the ecological impacts of all that. So we asked her about how she stays competitive. We asked both of them, you know, because there are the big box grocery stores, and how do you keep up with them? But with hers, she said, you know, she's a niche market in the fact that they don't sell her product anywhere. It was all organic, vegan, gluten-free, locally grown stuff. And I think her main thing was that she talked about marketing and education was the main way of her getting her staying competitive in this market. And I think it's just, she talked about how people are self-educating themselves and learning about local foods and getting them to know that, you know, they're paying more for a reason. It's because it's locally grown, it's better quality, it's healthier. And they're also part of the Feast On program, which is just a program that helps local markets and local farmers grow their food and promote it. Okay. So she talked about. So we talked about like where we can go in the future with this, and she's seeing trends with her own business, and she's talking about how this quote. I really like this quote because she said, "Food is transforming every day. We're gonna have to get closer to have to eat closer to home." And she talked about how people don't like to change unless they absolutely have to, and we're starting to get to that point where imported foods there's a lot of impact coming from them. So, so she's saying we're about to hit that point where local markets are going to be a higher commodity. And she also brought up the same thing with how to promote it is higher subsidies and taxes, and also education. So we're going to talk about now the economic implications.
So very quickly, going back to Michael Sacco's point about translocal and sort of the connection between producer and consumer and using food for social development. He had a very good point in our interview with him where he talked about rather than producing food for a profit motive, these farmers which he works with, they produce this food because they have a genuine attachment to it. They get up in the morning and they think, you know, I'm going to make something great. Rather than, you know, fulfilling themselves with money, they're actually they feel good producing this stuff, and they enjoy the feeling that it's a good product and it's helping people feel better.
Yeah, again, common theme between all of our research and both interviews, subsidies, taxes, and education was the biggest thing that would help promote local markets, especially from the government perspective. I think they have the biggest role in getting awareness out about local markets.
And something I think we would want to explore in the future is the socio-economic side. From the consumer perspective, I mean, in 2006, Ipsos Research did a study that asked Canadians if they preferred imported or local goods, or foods particularly, and they found that 71% of Canadians think that local foods help the local economy, and that 70% believe that buying locally supports is better from a health perspective and better for the environment. So I think that with that in mind, you would imagine that there might be a shift towards local food rather than, you know, going to big box stores. But at the same time, there are barriers to accessing these markets. These markets aren't always accessible to every individual. They're often in areas that maybe have individuals who are more upwardly mobile. So I think there's that component that I think we want to look into in the future.
Yeah.
I know this is kind of like you just mentioned it going forward, so I haven't thought about it at all. But what do you think could be done realistically to improve access to that market?
So we got a couple of different different answers from Michael Sacco and Lisa Sweetman. Michael Sacco was sort of promoting the idea of using the tax system as an avenue to sort of do the subsidies and negative incentives for larger producers. And Lisa Sweetman was talking more about the idea of promoting self-reliance and educating people to sort of build that capacity for adopting local foods. Because in her view, like, we're going to be reaching that crisis point very soon.
Yeah, I also think, like, when she mentioned marketing, I think that's a huge thing, because it's just, I think awareness is actually a major issue. It's just people don't know why they should buy local, they just buy it for the sake of buying it. And, like, I think that comes from, like, places like institutions like schools and universities, and I think the government can take steps to just, you know, put out some media, like information pieces, like, you know, pamphlets or whatever, wherever they can put it, and just little advertisements, you know, talking about the impacts of consuming imported foods versus local foods.
And I think another part is that the city can really play a role in fostering this community that revolves around food. I think that there are a lot of areas in larger cities that are sort of they're sort of food deserts, and I think that there are community activists that would, if the city worked with the communities and sort of indicated where they could go about accessing the proper resources to, you know, build relationships with farmers outside of cities and things like that. That I think a lot of good could come of that if the city showed people how they could start their own markets.
And I think just an increase in local markets is going to help for sure.
One thing it might be worth mentioning in your paper, and I don't know, Jody, if you've heard of any documentation of this, other than maybe talking to Wolfgang Fenning, but After 9/11, the borders with the U.S. were closed for 3 days, and as you already mentioned, we import about 50% of our food from the United States. There was a huge crisis on grocery store shelves, not having enough food, and that was just 3 days. And so, it's just a hint at the vulnerability that we face. And so, if you could explore that a little bit more, or maybe some other, I don't know, other authors who might be kind of talking more apocalyptically about,
Yeah,
you know.
it's hard to talk about something as complex as this in a short time. Like when we started off, we were looking solely at economic implications. But the thing about political economy and socioeconomy is like they're all so closely interrelated. So when we talk about, to use something that we're all probably familiar with, systems resilience, like that example of 9/11, it's like that system was not resilient because something as simple as like cutting off one flow basically had massive implications for the rest of society. And food is something that's so central to our everyday lives that if we can't build that capacity within the system for it to effectively manage itself during crisis, then we're going to be facing larger and larger problems in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges of having a local system that can stand by itself in case something like that does happen.
I assume then that if you started with the economic picture, you've looked a little bit at the trade, sort of the trade flow, because it appears to be a trade deficit, but when you look at it, the numbers are deeper, right? There's stuff going out as well as stuff coming in, and then looking at import replacement opportunities. I know there's some studies that we had done and that were